Let me suggest that every single person who follows Christ has to die. Oh, yeah. I did that in the baptism thing, right? I died when I was baptized. Yeah, you did. But I think it even goes beyond that. Did you know that none of the New Testament books or letters actually came with titles? Those were added later by other individuals that felt like they needed titles. See, the Hebrew tradition with the Old Testament was to take the first few words of the book, and that was the title. So the book of Genesis was never called the book of Genesis. It was called In the Beginning. Moses said, in the beginning, that's the name of the book, or in those days, the book of Numbers. And so that's how they would identify those particular books. Well, that practice didn't carry over to the New Testament, and so many of the books initially just had no title at all. They were anonymous, even the Gospels. It doesn't say the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John. Those were added later. Same thing is true with the book that we have here, the book of Acts. Now, when we think of the book of Acts, we understand that that's generally a shorter version of a longer title. The Acts of what? The Apostles, exactly. The Acts of Apostles. Now, that name makes us think that the book of Acts is going to be about who? The apostles, right? These are the actions of the apostles. Well, it's a bit puzzling when we get in there to find that it's not really quite as cut and dried as that. Actually, the first half of the book is about one apostle, Peter. The second half of the book is about another apostle who wasn't one of the original 12, Paul, who's not really, he is an apostle, but he wasn't one of the ones that followed Jesus. And then there are a whole bunch of stories about individuals who weren't even apostles. Today, Stephen is one example. Next week, we're going to look at Philip. And so it's kind of interesting that title was chosen when the actual mover and shaker, the primary person who is behind all of what's happening in the book of Acts is not an apostle, but rather the Holy Spirit. And so I think a much more apt title, a better title would be the acts, the actions, the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is continuing God's mission, is continuing Jesus' mission to expand the kingdom, to allow the preaching to take place in places where it had never gone, and the individuals that the stories highlight are the ones who are allowing God to use them. So today we're talking about Stephen. Now, Stephen is an outstanding man, full of faith, full of the Holy Spirit, full of grace, and he's sitting right back there. You know, I am so grateful, and I talked to him about this. I am so grateful that we have Stephen, who is such a faithful, good guy. It would have been really hard to preach this sermon about Stephen, and everybody think about this rascally scoundrel Stephen who's over here. And so Stephen is truly lives up to his name. Now, his name means crown. Stephanos means crown in Greek. And Stephen in the Bible truly was a crown on the head of the church and of this new movement that was spreading. Stephen first appears in the book of Acts in chapter 6 in the middle of a controversy where there was some discussion between two groups of widows and the people that were supplying food for them. There was the Greek-speaking widows and the Hebrew-speaking widows. And there was a discrepancy about who was getting what food and how much food. And so the apostles decided to name 6 individuals to serve as the individuals to kind of resolve this issue. Stephen is the first on the list. He was a man full of faith, full of power, full of the Holy Spirit, but he began by serving tables. That's where Stephen began. Keep that in the back of your mind. From there, he progressed. And once the apostles saw that he had God working in him and through him, then he began to do miracles. Up to this point, only the apostles had done miracles, but now Stephen was doing miracles. and then he is preaching, and his message gets on the radar of this group of synagogue attenders, and they decide to pick a fight with him. And the areas that they want to pick a fight have to do with his preaching about the temple and about the law of Moses. We don't know exactly what Stephen was preaching, but it would have been something like this. God, you don't have to go to the temple anymore. God doesn't live in the temple. You can worship God wherever you are, especially within the Roman Empire, which was the world that they knew. God is all of those places, which infuriated the Jews because they wanted everybody to go to temple. It kind of reminds me of what happened with COVID. You know, back in the old day, we used to preachers used to say, if you don't go to church, you're going to be in trouble. I can't even say it without stumbling over my words because I never said that in my life, and so it's not natural. But it's like, man, if you don't go to church, you're going to be in trouble. And then COVID hit, we shut down church, and we said, well, you know, it's okay if you don't go to church, but you have to watch the screens. Well, we sometimes find ourselves with messages that don't communicate properly what we're trying to say. And the Jewish community as a whole, the Jewish leaders, did not communicate God's presence in an accurate way. And so Stephen's pointing that out. Stephen's also preaching something like, you know, to be saved, you don't have to follow the law of Moses. All you have to do is put your faith in Jesus. Well, that didn't go over very well either with the Jewish communities. Because for them, you can believe in Jesus as long as you're following the law of Moses. So both of those charges were raised against Stephen. But the problem was that the evidence against him was weak. So when you have a weak case, you have to make a choice. Do you continue with the case, or do you find someone that can bolster your case even if it's not true? So they found some people to lie, and then they charged Stephen with these two counts. He's brought before the Sanhedrin, or the ruling council, and the question placed before him at the beginning of chapter 7 is, are these accusations true? And then he begins his speech, which takes all of chapter 7. Now, this is the longest speech of any individual in the book of Acts. It's longer than Peter's sermon on Pentecost. It's longer than any of Paul's discourses. And in the ancient world, one of the ways that you showed how important a person or a document was by its length. This, arguably, is one of the most important speeches that we'll find in the book of Acts. But it wasn't an apostle. It was Stephen, the guy that started off serving tables. Now, when Stephen begins his defense, he doesn't actually give a defense. You know, a defense is like, no, I didn't do it. I was over there. Or this is not what I said. That's not true. They're lying. Stephen doesn't do any of that. What he does is he takes a big, huge step back and paints a picture of what the history of Israel really looks like through God's eyes. He revisions the history of Israel for these Jewish individuals who had been studying the Old Testament all these years, but he's trying to emphasize three basic points. The first one is that the activity of God is not limited to the geographical area of Israel. So he begins with the patriarchs, how God talked and worked with Abraham, and then Moses down in Egypt, and then continuing all through that ministry there. God is not limited by land. And the second point is that worship of God is not limited to the temple. You can worship God from any location. That is not the most important thing. And again, that didn't go over real well. The third point is that the Jewish people as a whole had consistently and constantly rejected God's messengers, his prophets, and then even the most important of his messengers, the Son of God himself. And so when Stephen gets to the conclusion of the sermon, the people are already worked up, and then he takes off the gloves and he goes right at them and calls them stubborn, heathen at heart, and deaf to the truth, resisting the work of the Holy Spirit, resisting God, and then the icing on the cake, the cherry on the sundae, was that they had killed the Messiah. Not that they had killed Jesus, they had killed the Messiah. The Jewish leaders were so infuriated. They covered their ears because they couldn't allow this blasphemous talk to enter. And so when Stephen sees the Messiah standing next to God, when he sees Jesus standing next to God, they couldn't stand it. They grabbed him, they took him out of the city because they didn't have authority and they would not murder anyone within the city. And the way stoning happened was a little bit different than I had imagined. You know, when I first started reading this when I was 19, I imagined they just picked up rocks like we did when we were kids and throw them at each other. And I wonder, how is that going to, kill somebody? It might create a bruise, maybe some blood, but I don't see how you could ever kill somebody with that. Well, evidently what they would do is take you to a hill and throw you over the cliff or the hillside, and then roll boulders on top of you, and then pick up as large a rock as you could find and then throw it down the hill, and then that accumulation of wounds would eventually cover that person to the point that they did not survive. It's a horrific kind of a thing. Very, very physical, but very grotesque at the same time. And Stephen, while this is happening, he's praying. Now, there were martyrs in the first century. There had been martyrs, Jewish martyrs, for a couple hundred years now as they fought the Roman oppression. But one of the things that the martyrs did right before they died was they would call down a curse on these people. Yeah, you can kill me, but guess what? You're going to get yours. God's coming for you because of what you're doing to me or to his people. But Stephen doesn't do that. He doesn't call down fire from heaven. He doesn't call down a curse. He doesn't threaten revenge. He asks God to forgive them, to not hold that sin against them. We see how Stephen lived in Jesus' footsteps and followed after him. God was the most important thing in Stephen's life. God was the center of his sermon and center of his speech and the beginning and the end and everything he did. Stephen truly was a witness, but in the truest, broadest sense of the word. Some of you might have read somewhere or heard that the Greek word for witness is martyr. And so Stephen was a witness, a martyr for Jesus, the first Christian martyr. And I think he achieved that not because he set out to die. He set out to be a humble servant and do what God needed. And that started by serving tables. And as his service grew, the challenges also grew with that. The word humble in English comes from a Latin root, hummus or hummus, and it's not what you eat at a Mediterranean restaurant. This is the hummus or the humus of fertile soil, that rich, dark soil. And those are the salt of the earth, literally the soil of the earth kind of people that allow the Spirit of God to plant seeds in their hearts to then go where he wants. These are the individuals that are like sails, the sails on a sailboat, who by themselves, the sails look limp and weak and without much strength. But when the sail is positioned properly to catch the wind, that wind can move in such a powerful way that it moves huge boats through the water at amazing speeds. Well, Stephen is like that fertile soil. He's like that sail that allows the Spirit of God to push him where he wants to go. And really, Stephen was focused on God every single way. He was focused on Jesus. When Stephen died, he died like Jesus died. When Stephen prayed before his death, he prayed like Jesus. I deliver myself into your spirit, deliver my spirit into your hands. Hold not their sins against them. Stephen started like Jesus, serving tables and serving food and helping people in very, very basic ways. In all of this, Stephen was following Jesus. And that happened to lead, in his case, to death. For the vast majority of us, it will never lead to us having to defend our faith to the point of death. At least that's what we tell ourselves. Let me suggest that every single person who follows Christ has to die. Oh, yeah. I did that in the baptism thing, right? I died when I was baptized. Yeah, you did. But I think it even goes beyond that. I think there's a sense where what God is looking for are men and women who every single morning when they wake up are willing to be humus, that soil that's willing to be used by God. We're willing to be sails that allow the Spirit to blow through us to allow the Spirit to accomplish His purpose. See, I can't do that if I'm a rigid board where I have my will and we're going to do things my way, and I'm not going to go there and I won't talk to those people and I won't forgive that and I won't do this because that's my will. I was raised this way. And God's looking for people that are like sails, that are willing to be filled with the Spirit and go where the Spirit goes. And in Stephen's case, it ended with a crown as a young man. In our case, it might mean eating humble pie. It might mean asking forgiveness. It might mean being willing for someone else to be right. It might mean us acting in ways that go against what the world says. May our love for Jesus be so strong that we, like Stephen, can be his faithful witness. First by serving, and then by standing up and allowing the Spirit to take us where he wants to go.